My wife asked me for a divorce after 9 years of marriage. When I asked why, she said she couldn't tell me. 3 weeks later, her lawyer called me behind her back and said something that completely changed the way I saw my wife. He told me, "Your wife isn't trying to leave you. She's trying to remove your name from something before someone destroys your life." At the time, I thought he was talking about money. I was wrong. Throwaway account. This is long, but I need to write down the whole thing in order, because for months I only had it in pieces, and the pieces almost destroyed me. I never thought I'd say this, but for 3 months I genuinely believed my wife hated me. Not because we'd had some huge fight, not because I cheated, not because she found someone else. Actually, that's what made it worse. There was no obvious reason. One evening, she simply looked across our dining table and said, "I want a divorce," and I remember staring at her for several seconds because my brain refused to process the sentence. Then I laughed, not because it was funny. Because I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. Her name was Mara Voss. We'd been married for 9 years and lived in a converted lighthouse keeper's cottage outside a small coastal town called Bellwether Point, about an hour from the city, where the wind off the water rattled the old glass in the window frames every night like clockwork, and you learned to sleep through it or you didn't sleep at all. I restored antique furniture for a living, running a one-man shop out of a converted boathouse behind our property. Mara worked as a landscape architect, mostly for private estates and the occasional municipal park redesign. We weren't rich. We weren't struggling either. We had a mortgage, 2 agging cars that both needed work I kept promising to get to, a vegetable garden Mara insisted on maintaining even though I was convinced she was secretly at war with the tomatoes every single summer, and a dog named Pickle who had generously the emotional intelligence of a spoon. It wasn't a perfect marriage, whose is, but I thought it was a good one right up until that Tuesday. Mara didn't cry when she asked for the divorce, and that was the first thing that unsettled me, because Mara cries at dog food commercials and mediocre wedding toasts. She looked strangely, deliberately calm, like someone reciting a line she'd rehearsed enough times in the shower that the emotion had been sanded off it entirely. I put my fork down. "Are you serious?" "Yes." "Why?" She looked at me for a long moment and said, "I can't tell you." I thought I'd misheard her. "What?" "I can't explain." "Why not?" She looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring she still had on, which somehow made the whole conversation feel even more insane. "Because if I tell you, you'll try to fix it." "I don't even know what I'm supposed to fix." "I know." That answer made me angry in a way I don't think I'd ever been angry at her before. "So you want to end 9 years of marriage and you're not even going to tell me why?" She didn't respond. I stood up so fast my chair scraped hard against the floor and Pickle bolted for the other room. "Mara, is there someone else?" "No." "Did I do something?" "No." "Do you not love me anymore?" She hesitated, just long enough that I felt it in my chest before she even answered, and then she said quietly, "That's not the problem." That sentence stayed lodged in my head for weeks afterward, because if she still loved me, then what exactly was I being divorced for? The next morning she'd already contacted a lawyer, a man named Elias Wren, who I'd never heard of and who worked out of a converted railway office in a city neighborhood called Harrogate, all old brick warehouses and tiny specialty coffee shops that charged $6 for something with oat milk in it. Mara handed me the divorce papers at the kitchen table like she was handing me a grocery list. Everything in them was surprisingly reasonable. She wasn't demanding the house. She wasn't asking for most of my savings. She wasn't trying to take any part of my business. In fact, she was asking for considerably less than she was legally entitled to after 9 years of marriage. That should have made me suspicious immediately. Instead, in my grief and confusion, it made me think she was simply trying to make the ending as painless as possible, which somehow hurt more than if she'd fought me for everything. I told her I needed time and signed nothing. She nodded, packed a single suitcase, not even all her things, just the essentials, which I noticed and filed away without understanding why it mattered yet. And before she left, she stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame like she was memorizing the shape of it. I asked, "Are you really going to do this?" She looked at me for a long time, longer than the question warranted, and said, "I'm trying to make sure you survive it." And then she left, and I stood in our kitchen for a long time afterward, not entirely sure what had just happened to my life. The first 3 weeks were the worst of my adult life, worse than losing my father, worse than the year the business nearly folded. I was angry, then depressed, then angry again, in a cycle that seemed to reset itself every 48 hours whether I wanted it to or not. I started sleeping in the workshop out back because our bedroom felt wrong without her, the space too big, the silence too specific. My friends told me to move on. My sister Nadine, 8 months pregnant at the time and blunt as ever, told me Mara had probably met someone and didn't have the courage to say it outright. My neighbor, a retired fisherman named Otto who'd lived next to us for 6 years and had opinions about everything, told me I should get a lawyer immediately and stop being sentimental about it. Everyone had a theory. Nobody had an answer, and I was starting to lose the ability to care about the difference. Then something strange happened. I got a phone call from Elias Wren, Mara's own divorce lawyer, calling my personal cell, which felt like a violation of some rule I didn't know existed. I almost didn't answer it. When I finally did, he didn't say a word about the divorce itself. Instead, the first thing out of his mouth was, "Are you alone?" I actually stood up out of my chair. "What? Are you alone right now?" "Yes." "Good." There was a silence on the line long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then he said carefully, like each word cost him something, "Mr. Calder, your wife isn't divorcing you because she wants your marriage to end." I felt something drop through the floor of my stomach. "Then why?" His voice got quieter, almost a whisper, which was a strange thing to hear from a man I pictured as confident enough to argue in courtrooms for a living. "Because she wants your name removed from something." "What something?" He hesitated again. "A debt." I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound. "What debt?" "I don't know yet." "What do you mean you don't know?" "I've been trying to find out." And that was the moment I realized something in his voice that I hadn't clocked before. Elias sounded afraid. Not concerned in the professional, detached way lawyers are supposed to sound. Afraid, the way you sound when you've stumbled onto something bigger than the job you were hired for. I asked him, "Why are you calling me instead of Mara?" And he said, "Because she doesn't know I'm calling." And that single sentence changed the entire shape of the next 6 months of my life. I sat down at the kitchen table and told him to explain everything. He said that while reviewing Mara's financial records to prepare the settlement paperwork, standard procedure, nothing unusual, he'd found a pattern of payments going back years. Small ones at first, $180 here, $240 there, $500 a few months later, and then progressively larger amounts, eventually climbing into the thousands, all going out to a handful of different companies. But the companies had one thing in common. None of them, as far as he could determine with a basic corporate registry search, actually existed in any meaningful operational sense. Shell after shell after shell. He believed someone had been using Mara's identity to move money quietly through a network designed specifically so that no single transaction ever looked large enough to trigger a bank's fraud alerts. I asked the obvious question, why would that affect me? And he answered, flatly, because some of the money was transferred through an account in your name. The next day I went straight to my bank, the same branch I'd used since I was 22, and the manager looked at me like I'd just asked him whether money grew on trees behind the building. He checked my identification, then pulled up my account history, and frowned at the screen for a long moment before saying, "There's nothing unusual here." I told him what Elias had said. He checked again, more carefully this time, and his frown deepened into something else. "You have another account." I stared at him. "No, I don't." "Yes, you do." He printed out the paperwork and slid it across the counter, and I sat there in a plastic chair reading it like it belonged to a stranger, because it did in every way except the signature. The account had been opened 7 years earlier, 2 years into my marriage to Mara, and currently held almost $83,000. I had never seen it. I had never deposited a cent into it, but someone had clearly been moving money through it for years, in and out, small deposits followed by larger transfers, the kind of pattern that on paper looks exactly like laundering if anyone ever bothered to look closely. I asked for a copy of the signature card used to open it. He handed it over. I recognized it immediately. It was mine. Almost, close enough to pass a casual glance, close enough to fool a bored teller on a Tuesday, but off in the small ways that only someone who'd actually watched me sign 100 receipts would notice. The loop on the J a little too wide, the pressure a little too even, the kind of signature you get from someone who's practiced. Then I saw the address listed on the account. It wasn't our home. It was somewhere called Greyhaven Industrial Park, a name I'd genuinely never heard in 9 years of living an hour outside the city, and I had never once in my life set foot there. Greyhaven turned out to be exactly what the name implied: old shipping yards gone quiet, empty warehouses with broken skylights, a scattering of repair garages that all seemed to specialize in something vague like commercial fleet services, and railway tracks running rust-red between buildings nobody had painted in a generation. I drove out there the following Saturday with a printout of the account documents on the passenger seat like some kind of evidence I wasn't sure I was allowed to be carrying. The address on the account belonged to a company called Northstar Recovery Services, though there was no sign on the building. Nothing to indicate a business existed there at all beyond a metal door with a single buzzer and no name beside it. I knocked. Nobody answered. I knocked again, harder, and eventually the door opened just wide enough for a man to look out at me, probably in his 60s, grey beard, a faded blue work jacket, the kind of face that had spent decades being suspicious of exactly this kind of unannounced visitor. He looked at me for a second and said flatly, "You're not supposed to be here." I asked if he knew Amara Voss. His whole expression shifted, some careful neutrality cracking underneath it, and he started to close the door. I put my hand against it. "Wait." He looked at me through the narrowing gap and asked quietly, "Did she send you?" "No." He studied my face for what felt like a full minute, then slowly opened the door the rest of the way. "Come inside." The building wasn't an office in any conventional sense. It was an archive, floor-to-ceiling metal shelving units crammed with cardboard boxes, stacks of old financial documents, property records going back decades, shipping manifests, court filings, folders with handwritten labels in 3 different generations of handwriting. The man introduced himself as Gideon Pike and asked, not unkindly, why I'd come. I told him about the bank account, about Elias' phone call, about the signature that was almost mine. He sat down heavily in an old office chair and said, "Your wife told me this might happen." I felt something cold move through my chest. What might happen? You finding this place? I asked how he even knew Mara, and he didn't answer right away. Instead, he got up, walked to a filing cabinet in the back corner, pulled out a thick folder, and set it on the desk between us. My name was written across the tab in block letters. Jonas Calder. I opened it with hands that weren't entirely steady. Inside were copies of property transactions I'd never seen, loan agreements I'd never signed, tax documents with numbers that didn't match anything in my actual records, and photographs of my house, of my workshop, of my car parked in its usual spot, of Mara, of me, taken from angles that suggested someone had been standing across the street with a long lens for longer than I wanted to think about. I looked up at Gideon. Why were you monitoring us? He shook his head immediately. We weren't monitoring you. Then why do you have all this? He tapped the folder once like punctuation. Because someone's been trying to take your house. That made no sense to me at the time. Our mortgage was current, paid on time every month for 9 years. The property, a rare stretch of coastal land with an actual lighthouse keeper's cottage on it, was worth considerably more than what we still owed. Why would anyone bother going to these lengths for a house we already legally owned? Gideon explained slowly, like he was used to walking people through this exact confusion, that the cottage had a complicated history that predated us by decades. Before we ever bought it, the land had belonged to a development company that eventually went bankrupt during a downturn. The property was sold off in the bankruptcy proceedings, then resold once more a few years after that, and finally sold to us through what looked on the surface like an entirely ordinary transaction. But buried in that chain, one of the original ownership transfers, decades back, long before Mara or I had ever heard of Bellwether Point, had been fraudulent. Someone had forged documents to move the property out of its rightful owner's hands, and now, all these years later, an investment group had found a way to leverage that old, buried fraud to make a claim on land that was suddenly worth a great deal more than anyone had imagined back when the forgery happened. I asked what any of this had to do with Mara. Gideon looked at me steadily. Everything. 7 years earlier, before any of this touched our lives directly, Mara had been hired to redesign the gardens around an old coastal hotel 2 towns over, the kind of restoration job she loved best, all overgrown hedges and forgotten stone paths. During that project, while going through old storage buildings on the property looking for original landscape plans, she'd found something that didn't belong there, a box of decades-old property documents that had nothing to do with the hotel at all. She started pulling threads out of professional curiosity, the same instinct that made her good at her job, cross-referencing old deeds and transfer records the way some people do crossword puzzles for fun. What she eventually uncovered was a quiet, sprawling network of fraudulent property transfers stretching back 30 years. Houses, warehouses, small hotels, farmland, entire blocks of commercial real estate, all funneled over decades into the control of the same small handful of shell companies through forged documents and manufactured debts. And somewhere in that tangle, buried under 3 layers of resold paperwork, was our house. I couldn't make it fit together. We bought it legally, I said. Yes, Gideon agreed. Then what's the problem? He said, you bought the house legally, but somebody else believes they own the debt attached to it. And that distinction, small as it sounded, was apparently enough to unravel everything. The debt itself was entirely fake, but it had been built to look convincingly real. Someone had manufactured an old loan agreement using my identity, dated years back, claiming I had personally borrowed a substantial sum against the property, nearly $600,000, an amount so absurd for a man who restored antique furniture for a living that it should have collapsed under its own weight the moment anyone actually looked at it closely. But forged debts don't need to survive close scrutiny right away. They just need to exist on paper long enough to get filed, to get entered into a system, to become the kind of thing a court has to take seriously simply because it's there. If that loan agreement were ever formally accepted, our house, the actual physical land, the cliffside, the lighthouse, could potentially be seized to satisfy it. I asked Gideon the question that had been building in me the whole time. Why would anyone go through all this trouble over one house? He looked at me for a long moment, then pointed past my shoulder, out through the grimy window of that archive building, toward the thin grey line of ocean visible between 2 warehouse rooftops. Because your house isn't the valuable part. Then what is? The coastline behind it. A private development group, he explained. Been quietly trying to assemble a stretch of unbroken coastal property for a resort project for the better part of a decade, buying up neighbors one at a time, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. And our little strip of cliffside land was the last piece standing between them and a finished parcel worth an almost obscene amount of money once it was whole. Suddenly the fake debt, the shell companies, the secret bank account in my name, and even the divorce all clicked into a single shape in my head. Except for one piece: why was Mara divorcing me? I asked Gideon directly. He sighed, the particular sigh of someone who's been waiting for the question and dreading it anyway. Because the people doing this don't threaten anyone directly, that would leave evidence. Then what do? They destroy people financially, quietly, from a distance, until the person destroys themselves trying to fix it. He explained that if the company behind all this wanted the property badly enough, the cleanest path was to make it look like I had personally been involved in financial fraud. The secret bank account was step one: money laundered through my identity, traceable back to me, ready to be surfaced the moment it was useful. If that account ever became public, my reputation would collapse overnight. My small furniture business, built over a decade of word-of-mouth trust in a town where everyone knew everyone, would be finished. The house would get tied up in litigation for years regardless of who technically won. My finances would freeze the moment any investigation opened. And Mara, still legally tied to me, would be dragged straight down with all of it, her name and career attached to a scandal that wasn't hers. Unless, of course, she wasn't legally tied to me anymore when it happened. I stared at Gideon, the pieces finally locking into place with a click I could almost physically feel. So she left me to protect me. He nodded slowly. She wanted to separate her finances from yours before anyone could use her against you or use you against her. Either direction was dangerous once your identity was already compromised. I suddenly heard her voice again, standing in our doorway with her hand on the frame. I'm trying to make sure you survive it. I called her the second I got back to my car, hands shaking too hard to get the key in the ignition first. She answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear it in the silence before she even spoke. She already knew why I was calling. Mara, nothing. I know about the property. Still nothing. I know about the account. A long breath finally on the other end. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Her voice, when it came, sounded worn thin in a way I'd never heard from her before, not even during her father's funeral. Because I knew you'd try to fight. Of course I'd fight. No, she said, you don't understand. You would try to save me. You'd walk straight into it thinking you could out-argue people who don't argue, they just erase. I didn't have an answer for that. She kept going, quieter now. Jonah, these people aren't dangerous when you fight them. They're dangerous when they get patient, and fighting is exactly what makes them patient, because it gives them time to build the case against you properly, instead of rushing it. Over the following days in pieces, over phone calls she made from places she wouldn't tell me, Mara gave me the rest of it. The name behind Crown Meridian Holdings, the parent company quietly threading through every shell she'd uncovered, was a man called Silas Rook. I'd never heard of him, which didn't surprise me, but Mara had been investigating him, on and off, for the better part of 2 years. Silas wasn't some cartoonish criminal mastermind operating out of a warehouse basement. He was worse than that because he was respectable. He sponsored the annual Harbour Festival in 3 different coastal towns. He donated a new pediatric wing to a hospital 40 miles up the coast, with his name engraved above the entrance in brass letters. He sat on the board of a small liberal arts college and gave a commencement speech every other spring about integrity in business. His company owned hotels, a mid-sized construction firm, a regional shipping outfit, and a property management arm that on paper looked as boring and unremarkable as any other. He didn't steal houses outright. He acquired them patiently, through channels legal enough on the surface that nobody bothered to look underneath. And now, quietly, methodically, he wanted ours. 2 days after that call, Silas Rook phoned me directly. I still don't know how he got my personal number, and when I asked him, he laughed, easy and unbothered, and said only, "Small town." His voice was calm, almost warm, the voice of a man who was used to being liked. He told me he understood I was going through a difficult personal period, which made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't fully articulate at the time, because it meant he knew about the divorce, which meant he'd been watching closely enough to know things I hadn't told most of my own friends yet. Then he made his offer, smooth as anything. He would buy our property outright, for nearly 3 times what Mara and I had originally paid for it. I told him there was nothing to think about, and he said, without a trace of urgency in his voice, "Think carefully anyway." Then, just before hanging up, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Your wife thought the same thing at first," and the line went dead before I could ask him what exactly that was supposed to mean. That night I went out to the workshop, mostly because I couldn't sit still in the house anymore, and something felt wrong the second I stepped inside. Nothing had been stolen, my tools were all exactly where I'd left them, my current jobs untouched on the workbenches. One piece I'd been restoring for months, a 19th century writing desk I bought years earlier at an estate auction specifically because of its hidden compartment, a little brass latch panel under the writing surface that most buyers never even noticed, was sitting open. I hadn't opened it. I never opened it during restoration work, it wasn't part of the job. Inside, folded into quarters and yellowed with age, was a document I had never seen in my life, an original property deed. And reading it slowly, standing there in the workshop with the ocean wind rattling the tin roof the way it always did, I understood that this single piece of paper was about to unravel everything I thought I knew about how we'd ended up living in that house at all. The deed showed, in language plain enough that even I could follow it without a lawyer standing over my shoulder, that our house had never actually, legitimately belonged to the development company that supposedly sold it decades ago. It had belonged before all of that to a woman named Ilara Venn. I recognized the surname immediately because it wasn't a common one, and because Mara had mentioned it exactly once, years earlier at a family dinner I'd mostly forgotten until that exact moment. Ilara Venn was Mara's grandmother. Mara's grandmother had owned that stretch of coastal land, the cottage, all of it, decades before either of us was born. She had supposedly sold it, according to the official record everyone had relied on for years, but according to the deed sitting in my hands, she hadn't. The sale documents that had started the whole chain, the ones everyone downstream had trusted as the origin point, were forged, which meant the house Mara and I had bought in good faith, paid for honestly, lived in for 9 years, had actually been stolen from her own family a generation before either of us ever laid eyes on it. And that also meant something else, something that made my stomach drop all over again. If that was true, Mara herself had a legitimate, deeply personal legal claim to the property, entirely separate from anything to do with me, which finally explained, with a clarity that hurt almost as much as the original divorce had, why she'd been so determined to keep me out of the investigation from the very start. This had never just been about our marriage. It had been personal to her, in a way I hadn't understood at all. I drove to the small rented apartment she'd been staying in on the far side of the city. Up 3 flights of stairs I climbed 2 at a time. She opened the door before I even knocked, like she'd been watching for headlights from the window. I held up the deed. She looked at it, then closed her eyes and said quietly, "I knew you'd find it eventually." "You knew?" "Yes. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you out of it completely, no matter what it cost." I stared at her, feeling the anger from 3 months of confusion finally boil all the way up. "You divorced me. I know. You let me believe I'd ruined our marriage. I know. You let me spend 3 months thinking you'd stopped loving me. I know," she said again, and this time her voice broke on it, and she started to cry, really cry, for the first time since any of this began. "Because if they'd come after you directly, I already knew exactly what they'd do, and I couldn't live with being the reason it happened." She pulled out a folder of her own then, one she'd apparently been keeping separately from everything Gideon had shown me, and inside were photographs, my workshop, my car parked outside the hardware store in town, my sister Nadine's small house 2 counties over, the front of my bank, a printed page showing what looked like a rough log of my daily movements over several weeks, timestamps and locations, the kind of thing a private investigator compiles, not a jealous ex, not a curious stranger. I realized, looking at it, that whoever was behind this hadn't just been investigating Mara anymore. At some point, they'd started investigating me directly, and Mara had known it before I did. There was still one piece missing, and Mara found it before I did. The fake account opened in my name at Greyhaven hadn't actually been created 7 years ago, the way the paperwork claimed on its face. Buried deeper in the bank's internal records, which Elias eventually managed to pull with a formal request, the account had actually been initiated 8 years ago, a full year before Mara and I had even bought the cottage, back before either of us had any connection to this property or to Sela's Rook at all. And there had been exactly one person, back then, with regular, unsupervised access to my personal identification documents, my old business licenses, even my handwriting on hundreds of invoices and receipts, my former business partner. A man named Caleb Orr, who I'd gone into the furniture restoration business with straight out of trade school, and who had disappeared from my life 7 years earlier after quietly draining nearly everything out of our shared business account and vanishing without so much as a note. I'd spent months back then assuming he'd fled overseas somewhere, and eventually I'd simply stopped thinking about him at all, absorbed the loss, and rebuilt the business alone. Mara, working her own angle entirely separately from mine, had tracked him down. He hadn't gone overseas. He was living 40 minutes up the coast, working, it turned out, for Crown Meridian Holdings. We met him together in the end, at an old ferry terminal in a town called Northport that had mostly stopped running ferries a decade earlier, all peeling paint and empty benches and gulls fighting over abandoned fry containers. Caleb looked older, heavier, greyer at the temples than I remembered, but I recognized him the second he stepped through the door. I asked him, straight out, why he'd used my identity all those years ago. He shrugged, like it barely mattered anymore. "Because you were convenient. Clean record, steady income, a business partner who trusted me completely and never checked the books too closely. You were the easiest identity in the world to borrow." I wanted to hit him. I didn't. Instead I asked, "Did Mara know back then when she married me?" "No," he said without hesitation. "Did Silas know?" "Yes. Why would he care about some furniture restorer he'd never even met?" Caleb looked at me for a long moment, almost like he pitied me a little. Because Sealers knew the property fraud was going to surface eventually, once enough time passed and the land became valuable enough for someone to actually go digging. He wanted an identity already sitting in the middle of it, ready to take the fall the moment anyone came looking. You were never supposed to be part of the actual plan. You were insurance. Then he added the part I genuinely wasn't prepared for. He never expected her to marry you. That part wasn't planned. That part actually scared him once it happened. It turned out, according to Caleb, that Mara had started quietly investigating the old property fraud years before she and I had ever met, long before that hotel garden job, working off rumors and family stories about her grandmother's lost land that she'd grown up hearing at holiday dinners and half believed were exaggeration. She met me completely by chance, at a mutual friend's engagement party neither of us had particularly wanted to attend, and fell in love with me the ordinary, unremarkable way people do, with no calculation in it at all. It was only afterward, once she started connecting the threads more seriously, that she discovered my former business partner had been quietly working the exact same network she was investigating. Without either of us knowing it, I had already, unknowingly, years earlier, become tangled into the same fraud she was trying to expose. Mara hadn't married me for access to anything. She'd married me because she loved me, plainly and simply, and then had to live for years with the slow, sick realization that loving me had accidentally put a target on my back that had nothing to do with either of us personally, and everything to do with money neither of us had ever seen a cent of. I asked Caleb the last real question I had. Why didn't she just tell me all of this from the beginning instead of divorcing me? He looked at me and said, because Sealers had one piece of leverage left, and it wasn't the house, and it wasn't the money. What was it? Your sister. My heart genuinely stopped for a second. Caleb explained that Sealers' people had discovered, months earlier, that my sister Nadine was pregnant, and had made absolutely sure, through nothing more dramatic than a few too specific comments dropped in Mara's presence at exactly the right moments, that Mara understood he knew where Nadine lived, where she worked, when she traveled for her prenatal appointments. He never said a threatening word outright. He never needed to. The knowledge alone was the threat, dropped like a stone into still water and left to spread on its own. That was the real reason Mara asked for the divorce, not because she wanted to leave me. Because she genuinely believed, rightly or wrongly, that putting visible distance between us, in a way anyone watching could confirm, was the only thing she could do to make everyone connected to me, Nadine, the unborn baby me, even marginally safer while she finished building a case strong enough to end it. It took another 6 months after that very terminal meeting for everything to actually break open. Mara and Elias, working together now instead of around each other, along with a financial crimes investigator Elias brought in from the city, eventually assembled enough documentation, the forged original deed, the shell company records, the fabricated loan, Caleb's cooperation once he realized which way the wind was blowing and decided saving himself mattered more than staying loyal to Crown Meridian, to hand the entire thing over to the State Attorney General's office. The investigation, once it became public, moved faster than any of us expected. Crown Meridian Holdings collapsed within weeks, its other shell companies unraveling one after another like a pulled thread. Sealers Rook was arrested at his own house, not far, ironically, from another stretch of coastline he'd been quietly trying to acquire the exact same way. Caleb cooperated fully and avoided serious prison time in exchange for testimony, which I still have complicated feelings about, but which I understand practically speaking. The fraudulent property network, 30 years in the making, was finally publicly exposed, and our house, Ilara Ven's house, really all along was legally transferred into Mara's name as the rightful heir once the original forged sale was formally voided in court. She sold it a few months later. I didn't argue. Neither of us needed a lighthouse cottage on a contested cliffside anymore, and honestly, by then, neither of us could stand to sleep there. As for our own divorce, we never actually finalized it, but we didn't rush back together either, not for a long time. There was too much damage sitting between us, too many lies, even well-intentioned ones, too many nights I'd spent alone believing the person I loved most had simply stopped loving me back, with no idea she'd been sitting somewhere else entirely, alone in some rented apartment, wondering whether I'd still be alive by Christmas. About a year after everything finally settled, I got a letter from Mara, actual paper, actual stamp, asking me to meet her at the old lighthouse one last time before the new owners took possession. I went. She was standing right at the edge of the cliff when I arrived, the ocean grey and moving behind her the way it always was that time of year, and she said, without turning around at first, "I owe you 9 years of explanations." I managed something close to a smile. "That's a lot of explanations." She laughed quietly, the first real laugh I'd heard from her in what felt like forever, and then she said, "I don't expect you to forgive me for how I did it." I looked at her for a long time before I answered. "I already did, a while ago. She started crying again, the same way she had that day in her apartment doorway. But I don't know yet if I can fully trust you again, I added because it was true, and because I'd decided somewhere in that year that I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to make the reunion cleaner. She nodded slowly and said, I understand, I'd feel exactly the same. I took her hand anyway, out there on that cliff neither of us technically owned anymore. So we'll start there then, just there, nothing more than that for now. People still ask me sometimes why I didn't just walk away the moment my wife asked for a divorce and refused to explain herself. The honest truth is that I almost did. I spent 3 straight months genuinely believing Mara had simply stopped loving me quietly, the way people sometimes do after enough years, without any dramatic betrayal attached to it at all. I never imagined, not for one single second during those months, that the real reason was a stranger I'd never met patiently building a financial case against me for years, using a property neither of us had known was stolen, an ex-business partner I thought had vanished off the face of the earth, and a wife who loved me enough to let me hate her for a while rather than risk what she genuinely believed would happen to the people I loved if she didn't. She didn't divorce me because she stopped loving me. She divorced me because, for a while, she believed loving me openly was the most dangerous thing she could do to me. I still don't know for certain whether what she did was the right call. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe you don't actually get to quietly demolish someone's sense of their own marriage just because you've convinced yourself it's the only way to save them. But I do know one thing clearly now, a year and some months out from all of it. The worst part of that entire year was never the forged deed, or the secret bank account with my almost signature on it, or discovering my old business partner had been working against me the whole time without me knowing it. The worst part was simply this. While I was lying awake every night in an empty bedroom wondering why my wife had stopped loving me, she was lying awake somewhere else entirely, alone, wondering whether I would still be alive by Christmas. And if you ask me now whether I'd have wanted it done differently, the answer is yes, every time. I would have wanted her to trust me with the truth from the very first night, even knowing what I know now about how dangerous that truth actually was. Because I've come to believe that protecting the person you love mostly means standing next to them when things get genuinely ugly, shoulder to shoulder, not quietly pushing them away in the dark and hoping they never find out why. Edit for everyone asking in the comments. Yes, the property case is still working its way through appeals, and no, I'm not going to name the specific municipality because of ongoing litigation. Mara and I are taking things slowly, no set timeline, and honestly that's the only part of this whole story I actually have any control over anymore.